uses for military aircraft is to take photographs for observation. This ability to zoom in on locations and to pan along a setting has application in video editing. The zoom and pan technique has been used extensively by documentary filmmaker Ken Burns to bring a sense of storytelling to historic photos. Now you can employ this same technique to your video productions. In this section of the course, it's time for reconnaissance on the zoom and pan technique. After extracting the zipped practice folder, you will see the learning guide and one image which we will use for the zoom and pan technique. From inside Camtasia, import the zoom and pan image into the clip bin, drag it from the clip bin into the timeline. Now notice we can move the clip along the timeline, and as we hover over the edges and grab the edges by holding down the mouse, we can extend or decrease the length of the clip. Now that we have our clip in the timeline, we can adjust the playhead to a location about 5 seconds in. Click on the Zoom and Pan tab, and once you're in there, if you're not seeing the Zoom and Pan tab, you can click the More options and check for the available options that are not currently visible. But in the Zoom and Pan area, you see some control handles to the left-hand part of the screen. And it's these handles that will control the view that we have of the content. So I'm in the timeline, and I'm just going to drag one of the handles. Now notice as I drag the handle over on the left-hand side, that the content that we see on the screen on the right-hand side adjusts. This is showing what will appear when the video is rendered out and when we get to that point in the timeline. In this case, I want to zoom in on this image part of the screen. So if I have moved along the timeline and I'm no longer located on that edit point, if I start to adjust the content, notice I'm creating a new edit point. So I'm going to select that and delete that. I want to get back to this very synchronized edit point. So I'm just going to double click on the circle at the end of the animation, click on the zoom and pan panel, and now I can drag the handles so I have a more focused view of the image to show where the zoom and pan panel is. So now if I move back along the timeline, I start out full screen, and then as I move along the timeline, it zooms in to our graphics panel. I'm going to move down the timeline just a little bit. And now in this case, over on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm going to drag the visible image over to the zoom area. I'll drag the handle in the bottom right corner up toward zoom. So we're just focused on the word zoom. Now I'll move down the timeline a little bit. Now we'll drag the focus all the way over to pan. And I'll move down the timeline a little bit more. And now I want to zoom back out. So I can either do that by starting to drag the handle to zoom back out, or down here just below the preview monitor is a 4-arrowed indication to expand the content back to full screen. And all the zoom and pan techniques are in the timeline. If I want to extend the duration, I can grab the front end or the back end of the clip, and it will extend the amount of time that the duration takes place, and I can slide that along the timeline wherever I want. So we start out full screen, then we zoom in. Now notice if I grab one of these other clips, I can move it to the left or right if I want to change the sequence. I'm going to let it have a little bit of time. If I put it right next to it, it'll zoom to that point, and then it'll immediately start to move over. So I think the eye needs just a moment to rest on the focus once we've zoomed in on something. Give it a chance to focus in on that content. Then we'll get to the zoom section. Give that just a moment. Then we'll start our pan across. When we go to the pan across, I think that should take just a little bit longer, so I can extend that. So now we have a zoom across to the pan. Now notice that the visible line went up a little bit. I went a little bit diagonal. So if I wanted to straighten that out a little bit more, I can double click on the end point of that particular animation, click on the zoom and pan, just drag that down just a little bit. So I'm modifying that control point. If I don't end up just on that exact control point and say I try to move to it and I thought I was on the control point and I start to make that adjustment, notice that it will create another control point or another zoom and pan point, and that's unintended. It'll end up with a kind of a jittery presentation when you scrub across the part of the timeline, and it will jump when it gets to that point. So beware of those hidden elements. I'm going to select that and delete that particular section. And finally, we get up here a little bit where we've had a chance to get to the pan part, and then we'll zoom back out to full screen. Give that just a little bit more time. Reduce the length of our clip just a little bit, and then we're ready to render it out. Before we leave the render section, one more point while we're looking at the monitor here. There's a checkpoint on maintain aspect ratio. Everything that I just demonstrated was done with that selected, so that our image was maintained in the aspect ratio that it was designed. If that is not selected, it will allow you to drag your edit points in a way that may distort the image, and notice that it may end up with some unintended consequences. I usually work with that with the maintain aspect ratio on by default. Notice as I scrub along the timeline, it will act a little bit jittery. It gives you a rough idea of how it will appear, but to see it in action, we'll go ahead and render out the content. And here's a look at the finished presentation. We zoom in to the graphics, then it moves up to the zoom and pan area, zooms across, and then pulls back out to full screen. Now that we've seen it presented, we can make any adjustments in the timeline. Finish out the render there. So we can make any adjustments in the timeline based on the actual flow of the content. So this has been an introduction to the zoom and pan technique. It's time to try it out.